what we're talking about is allocating resources. How best to allocate resources to make the greatest happiness for everybody. Right?
Well, no, that's utilitarian, and this is what I was expecting, just essentially liberal utilitarianism. Essentially, you're presupposing a justice, which is just the greatest good for the greatest number. And I ask you what the greatest good is,
I
want
to help people, right?
And then you say harm.
I don't really care. I don't really care about these sort of abstract ideas.
No, actually, there is a purpose, and that's justice. And you say it's an abstract ideal, but I think that's absolutely vile that you would violate somebody's human rights, and you'd violate them for what? For some abstract notion of the public good. What would you imprison certain statistically prevalent groups who would commit crime? Would you prevent people from being of certain religions if they're associated with certain crimes? It's absolutely disgusting that you would even consider that punishment should be done for any other means than righting a wrong. This is why utilitarianism
this wrong. We can't right this wrong. You can't right. I don't think you're really right. But my point is, the point remains that when you want to use prisons as nursing homes, which is in essence what you're advocating for, that is a huge cost to the state, and every one of those dollars, we're not getting anything for any of those dollars.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of Perspective Philosophy, where I'm going to debate. Should I call you Delaniac or Chad, or what would you like to? Chad, and thanks for obviously agreeing to the debate. Sorry, I haven't even really spoke. I've just been in an absolute mess trying to make sure that all the technical difficulties just stop and leave us alone for once. But let's just. I'm happy to get into it, and I'm looking forward to this debate. And thank you again to Hanz for moderating. I really appreciate it.
This person on Twitch politics.
I don't think anyone could hear you guys. I'm sorry about that.
Fuck. All right, try again. Taking it back. Hi, everyone. I'm Hanz. I'll be moderating this debate. I won't really be participating. I don't really have a strong opinion on this, so I'm excited to be here. I'm everyone's favorite, extremely nice, extremely non-confrontational Twitch streamer. I'm having a great day, having a great time, and I'm just really excited to be here. So thank you both for accepting me as the mod for this. I'm really excited to put my mod hat back on because I haven't done a lot of moderation for a bit. So, but yeah, all right. Let's start with Perspective Philosophy. Want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, so hello, my name is Perspective Philosophy. I study philosophy, or at least I have been studying philosophy through my PhD on specifically on ethics and animal rights, arguing for a Hegelian approach. I do streams and talk about ethics and veganism, really. That's essentially me.
Hell yeah. All right, Chad.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chad, at Chad Not Chad on Twitter. I don't have a sort of practice intro because I'm not a streamer. I just tweet occasionally. But I'm also a PhD student, but not in anything that's relevant to this. I've got an interest in politics, got an interest in criminal justice reform in this case. So that's what brought me to this debate. So I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, and the Nordic model. Plug your Nordic model thing.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I do run a podcast with a good friend of mine named Sid. It's called The Nordic Model. We basically interview people about, kind of social democratic socialist type policies. Just recently, we had the chance to interview Matt Brunig, which is very exciting. Check that out in the next couple of weeks. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Thank you both so much. All right. So here's the ground rules of the debate. I'm going to try and jump in as little as possible, unless I think things are going absolutely off the wall. If I start talking, both of you stop talking. In regards to this, you're both going to get a timed 4-minute intro. I'll give you a sign. I'll be like something like this. I'm like, hey, when you have about a minute left, just to make sure that you know you're on time. So both of you will get an uninterrupted 4-minute intro to lay out your position. You're both big philosophy guys, so I want to make sure you have enough time to be able to adequately explain your position. Then we're gonna do a fun thing afterwards where you both get 3 minutes to, in your best words, describe and steelman your opponent's position, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're not talking past each other for the purpose of this debate. After that, we'll go into probably about an hour 20, hour 30 of open discussion, followed by probably a 15-minute Q&A with the audiences at the end of the debate. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me, yeah.
All right, which one of you wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first, unless if you want to go first. It's up to you.
You can go ahead if you want to.
Are you sure? Okay, because I guess because I'm defending, the justice of life without parole.
Sure.
So just as to begin the opening statement, I think that the most important thing to begin with is the parameters of this debate, which I think is the philosophy of law, not necessarily an examination of a current criminal justice system. I'm not here to talk about necessarily the inequality and inadequacies of the United Kingdom's or the United States' justice system per se. These contextual applications of life without parole are not necessarily an issue with the sentence itself, but with the justice system and the legality that exists within the state. For example, institutional racism is a problem in the United States. Many people are incarcerated unjustly and given, to be entirely honest with you, far too harsh of a sentence for the crimes that they've committed. I would only argue that life without parole should be given to those who commit murder. And murder I will define in a moment. On top of that, there is also issues in terms of lack of public funding, appropriate facilities, all of these issues, enforcement. These are issues not necessarily with the concept of life without parole, but issues with the state itself. If you were to say, life without parole shouldn't exist because of institutional racism, I will say institutional racism shouldn't exist and life without parole is absolutely fine. So apart from those being tangential to the debate, I think that we should focus on fixing those issues and keep life without parole as a form of punishment. So past that point, why should we have life without parole? I would say that we should have life without parole or a whole life sentence, as in an individual should be incarcerated until death if they commit murder. And that is only if they commit murder. Any other crime, I do not think, should be given a whole life sentence. I would say it is wholeheartedly unethical because it would require an infinite amount of punishment or an unlimited amount of punishment for a finite amount of crime. So the reason I would take, for example, life without parole as qualitatively different to other punishments is because murder is qualitatively different to other crimes. And let me explain. If you have, for example, a crime like theft, theft can be really boiled down to how much it impacts an individual's life, how much value you've taken from the expression of that individual's life. What have you done to that individual in relation to their experiences in the world, their attempts to obtain good within the world? How have you impacted and impeded their moral goals? In the case of in the case of murder, you have eliminated that individual. You have not simply impeded their subjectivity, you've annihilated their subjectivity. It is infinitely more weighty than any other crime for the fact that no amount of restitution can undo the death of the victim. The victim has no chance of obtaining a life free of the pain and suffering that you've caused. They are essentially gone, and there is no ability to restore those individuals to life. So they cannot be qualitatively the same. You can give, people their money back. You cannot give them their life back. You can give people their freedom back, and you can give them a value which is akin or qualitatively or quantitatively similar, but you can't give them the entirety of their existence back. And so I would say it as an infinite amount of debt that is owed by the individual who commits murder to the party that is victimized. And as such, an infinite debt must be paid with an infinite price, and that would be the life of the party who commits the crime. Now, the only reason I'm against death in this respect, capital punishment, is because of erroneous conviction. I see life without parole as essentially a stopgap to prevent individuals from being falsely convicted and then killed before the real perpetrator is then brought to justice, or a false conviction can be overturned. I think that is the only thing that would stop me from being pro-capital punishment. Why do I have problems with the parole? So parole or rehabilitation in general implies the possibility of forgiveness without necessarily taking into consideration whether the individual should be forgiven or not. An individual should be punished for the crime that they've committed and then atone for that crime with the punishment. That's essentially it. So if they've committed a crime, the punishment is atonement and essentially settles the debt between the parties. It essentially allows for equality to be restored between two individual parties within a justice system. And that is essentially why, Lady Justice holds a sword in one hand and a scale in another. In relation to rehabilitation and how it can be beneficial for, non-murderous criminals, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I wouldn't call it rehabilitation. I think we should educate people and allow them to make their own choices. I think that the movement towards rehabilitation in our state today is usually the propagation of psychological manipulation evoked from notions of determinism and egoism, which are built upon liberalism. I think liberalism lends itself to rehabilitation, which actually just produces docile bodies of individuals who follow laws, who commit good behavior. In other words, don't prevent the functioning of the state and the accumulation of capital, whilst allowing for a certain class of individuals to reap the rewards, whilst not considering the victims of crimes. And so the only reason that we should punish, and the only time punishment is appropriate, is in relation to the crime that is committed. We do not punish people because they are a risk to public safety. We punish them to right the wrong that was done on the crime. Punishing people to undo public safety, to facilitate public safety, I see as wholeheartedly unjust. If you punish people for crimes they have not committed, that is absolutely unethical, and I see it as conceited. You are essentially using the other individual as a means to an end in order to facilitate some sort of societal goal. So, 1 second. Okay. Sorry, so someone was waving at us. So, yeah, and on top of that, I would say that there is a separation, which we can get into, between murder and manslaughter, which is obviously within UK terms. And I think that needs to be obviously made clear. Not all homicide should be given life without parole. And with that, there we go.
All right. Thank you so much, Lewis. All right. I didn't want to cut you off, and so I actually let you go for that was about 7 minutes.
Oh my God!
So
sorry.
No, it's okay. I didn't want to. You want to roll. I didn't want to stop you. All right. So in the interest of fairness, we will also give Chad 7 minutes for his opening statement as well. So Chad, take it away. Oh,
we can't hear you, man.
Oh, you muted.
Sorry.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah. So broadly, I see the purpose of. I think prison can be evaluated. The prison can be evaluated on roughly 4 different axes. So the function of prison, right? So one is roughly what Lewis made the case for, which is retribution. So this is in essence punishment for its own sake. Secondly, there's rehabilitation. So this is taking someone who does not currently have the means of participating in society and giving them the means to do so. Second is incapacitation. So this is taking someone who poses a danger to the community and preventing them from causing further harm. And the last is deterrence. So this is preventing other people from committing crimes in the future. Right? In my view, these are the sort of, to varying extents, different penal systems, serve these 4 goals. So the question is, how does life without parole fare? Well, so on the last 3, it's an utter failure. Rehabilitation, clearly, it doesn't accomplish because the idea is that we're never letting anyone out of prison. As far as incapacitation goes, it's a failure there as well. So life sentences. Generally speaking, people tend to age out of crime, which means that as they get older, they're less likely to commit crimes. So, for example, I think the peak age for committing murder is 20 years old. By the time you hit 30, the risk is halved. By the time you hit 40, it's halved again. Even chronic offenders don't tend to commit crimes past their late 30s. And so in that sense, the amount of public safety that you gain with each additional year of incarceration diminishes, while the cost of doing so increases. As people get older, as they age, it's increasingly costly to care for them. And this is true not just in general. It's in general more costly to give care to elderly people, but particularly in prison because it's such a stressful environment, and because the people coming into prison are generally in poor health to begin with. And so the result is that when you commit to imprisoning someone for life, that's $1 million investment up front that you're committing to incarcerate someone for the rest of their lives. And I'm not a deficit hawk, right? But these dollars do come with an opportunity cost, namely that they could be put to much better use through evidence-backed ways to prevent future victims from occurring, right? So every dollar that's spent here is a dollar that's not spent preventing future victims. At the end of all this, right? So it fails. Oh, and it also fails in deterrence. I missed that. So generally speaking, the consensus is that long sentences don't affect don't help with deterrence. What matters is certainty of punishment, not the length of the sentence, right? So some small sentences have some marginal effect, but large sentences, don't really matter so much. Which makes sense. You put yourself in the mindset of a criminal, generally not considering the probability that you get caught. Often people who commit crimes are, very frequently are inebriated or not in a totally rational state of mind. And so generally people aren't thinking, well, I'd kill this person if the sentence were 20 years, but not if it were 25, or I'd kill this person if I get parole. If it's possible that if I get caught, I'd get parole. Generally not what people think. What matters is the certainty of getting caught, right? So it leaves us with retribution, which is basically, sort of what Lewis laid out here. And to me, I don't see, I don't see a good reason to punish someone if that punishment doesn't do anything. If it doesn't improve people's lives, right? I think we should evaluate life without parole like we would any other public policy, right? When we're looking at public policy, we're looking at how can we use government funds to improve people's lives. And in this case, it's not clear to me how it improves people's lives. People will cite cite victims. The reality is it's really not clear the extent to which long sentence lengths really improve victim well-being. I mean, you can look sort of across countries. It's not clear that in countries like Norway, which even go much farther than abolishing life without parole, but indeed abolish life sentences entirely. Victim, certainly trust in the justice system is higher there than in the United States. Not clear that victim well-being is improved by this, and more to the point, those dollars that we're spending, functionally using prisons as nursing homes, could be used to provide restitution, provide counseling, provide these things, which don't fill the hole, right? Nothing can make them whole, including a long sentence. What people need, right? To the extent that these people are indebted, what these people need isn't for the offender to serve, to spend their twilight years, in prison, being abused by guards and prisoners and these sorts of things. What these people need, I mean, to the extent that we can make them whole, even partially, are the things that I mentioned. Compensating them for their life, for the lack of income from their loved one, providing counseling, these sorts of things. And at the end of the day, it's not surprising, I don't think, that for example, the European Court of Human Rights ruled life without parole as a violation of people's human rights, concluding that prisoners have a right to hope. The ICC, this is the International Criminal Court, the body that tries people for genocide and war crimes, doesn't use life without parole. Most European countries don't use life without parole. The UK is one exception. Most Latin American countries don't use life without parole. It's a pretty rare sentence. And the reason being is at the end of the day, it's a poor use of public funds, and there's an opportunity cost for each of those dollars that we're spending doing this. Moreover, and maybe Lewis will accuse us of conflating application with sort of the theory of the law, but I don't think the application and the law are separable. There's the idea that long sentences, life without parole included, put an upward pressure on other sentence lengths. So, for example, to sort of quote the American Law Institute, they argue in essence that the most severe penalty in a criminal sentencing system serves as an anchor point, which defines the scale of the penalties beneath it, right? So the idea is that sentences here are generally proportional, and so the most extreme sentence is life without parole. Then this inflates the other sentences as well, right? And you can say, well, in principle, we couldn't do that. This is how it happens. And so, to quote from them directly, the entire scale of authorized sanctions has some tendency to be stretched upward or compressed downward, depending on the absolute maximum is located. So not only do life sentences not serve to rehabilitate the people who've committed crimes, but do these serious crimes. But they also don't. They also actively harm rehabilitation efforts for other crimes by driving mass incarceration. And again, of course, as Louis said, he wants to sort of sidestep the racism issue, which is that these sentences are disproportionately the brunt of these sentences is disproportionately bore by people of color in the United States. And again, you can say, well, we just do away with racism. But at the end of the day, right, our institutions are imperfect, no matter what. You can talk about the philosophy of law all you want, right? At the end of the day, when we actually put these institutions in practice, they're imperfect. And so, given that that's the case, given that there are going to be people for whom we do sentence to life without parole, there are going to be people always who are fucked over by those. And so we should limit. And so in essence, we should limit the state's power to fuck them over in that way. By denying them the ability to sentence someone to giving someone a life sentence without parole. Lewis mentioned. Actually, I'll wait.
I was gonna say, like, we just passed 7 minutes. If you want to finish that up,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, prisons aren't equipped to be nursing homes, and we shouldn't make them be. Right. There's little reason to deny people the possibility of parole. Other than punishment for punishment's sake.
All right. Thank you so much, Chad.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we're going to do, this is going to be the fun part. So we're going to throw it back to Louis for a second, and I want you both try and take a little less than 3 minutes. You don't have to qualify everything, but just make sure that we're on the same page. 3 minutes, define and steelman your opponent's position, and then at the end, I want the opposition, so in this case, like Chad, say whether you feel like that is an adequate representation of your beliefs. And if not, we'll have to do a little brief back and forth to make sure we're on the same page, just to make sure, again, that we're not strawmanning each other for the purpose of this conversation. We want to make sure this is as good as discourse as possible, even if it does get heated. I want to make sure that we all know what we're talking about. So, Louis, 3 minutes. Describe Chad's position as charitably as possible. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So thanks for your exposition there. If I understand your position correctly, you're arguing that there are 4 types of justification for, or 4 types of reasons given for punishment or, penality. Those are retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence, and
incapacitation.
And incapacitation. Thank you. So in that, you argue that you were saying that there was public safety as justification for incarceration, the bringing back into the fold, if you will, of criminals who've committed crimes, allowing them to participate into society, rehabilitation, deterrence, preventing further crimes, and incapacitation, also preventing further crimes. You pointed towards the opportunity cost of sentencing with whole life sentences or life without parole as being pretty severe, costing up to $1 million, which could have otherwise been spent on victim restitution. You pointed towards the well-being of the criminals, perhaps being violated, even violating their human rights, as they may have a right to hope. And you also pointed towards it being the upward standard of sentencing from which all other sentences can be measured against, and ultimately causes an upward pressure which leads to lengthier and more harsh sentences for pettier crimes.
Yep.
All right.
That's pretty accurate.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right. Now, Chad, if you can do the same for Louis.
Yeah. So basically what I got from Lewis's opening statement was that he views he views sort of, first of all, the philosophy of law and the application of law are separate from one another. Let's discuss the former. So to the extent that racism plays a role in the application of life without parole, this is irrelevant to debate. The debate, what matters is we can just get rid of the racism and leave the life without parole. The reason why he supports life without parole specifically for murder is because murder is qualitatively different from other crimes. It causes an infinite harm, to the victim itself. He didn't support the death penalty because of the possibility of erroneous conviction, which I think is a valid fear. So why parole specifically is wrong is it implies the possibility of forgiveness, so that these people should, even quote, should be forgiven.
This is there anything you'd like to add or amend for that?
I mean, we can always get, obviously go through it as we're backwards and forwards anyway. So yeah.
Was that adequate in regards to like what he did describe?
Yeah, from what he did describe, I think that was fair enough. Yeah.
All right, excellent. All right, we're gonna move into the open again. You can get a little spicy. Please don't start screaming over each other, because then I'll start screaming over both of you. So we're gonna go into, like I said, about an hour 20 of open. I mean, probably about an hour 15 now, because we had really long ass opening statements. But an hour 15 of open discussion, followed by the Q&A. So let's get started. Either of you, wherever you want to take this now. I'm throwing it away to you guys. I'm only gonna jump in if absolutely necessary, either because you're not understanding each other or you're just like screaming. So take it away, guys.
Okay.
If it's okay, if you don't mind, do you mind if I start?
Well, if you wanna ask us a question, or if you want to make a statement, yeah, go for it.
I wanted to push a little bit on the erroneous conviction point that you mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in some sense, it seems a little bit strange. This seems like an obvious case where the application of the law and the law itself are not separable, right? I mean, this is the erroneous conviction, that's a problem with the application of the law, right? Not the law itself.
I mean, if it's any consideration, I would give criminals the option to kill themselves. So I would say that if you're convicted with life without parole, you can take your own life. It's just more of an acceptance of our own limitations.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, it's precisely our acceptance of our own limitations, which is why I would argue why we shouldn't have life without parole either.
Yeah,
right?
Well, I mean,
that's one of the arguments.
We could always say as well, I would call life without parole. I'd be happy to call it death by incarceration, if that's also.
It's not really important to me what we call it. My point is that, like, for the same reason that you oppose the death penalty, right, out of fear of erroneous convictions, right? I mean, I agree in some sense that life without parole it improves upon the death penalty in the sense that it's in principle possible. Later, evidence is found and we end up exonerating this person. The reality, though, is this doesn't really happen. So this is maybe perhaps the only argument for the death penalty over life without parole. And I would prefer life without parole to the death penalty. I'll include it. But on this point in particular, because of the way this actually works in practice. The death penalty, there's in some sense a deadline, and so a lot of work is done in order to prove the innocence of people who are on death row. This doesn't happen for people who are served life without parole. Right? They don't. The reality is they don't get the same attention, and so they end up serving out their life sentences. Right? So to the extent that we're worried about erroneous conviction, I would say that applies just as much. That worry applies just as much to life without parole as it does to death penalty.
But it also, I mean, like, you get a lot more. I mean, like, to be fair, with death, you do get a massive appeals process as well. And to be entirely honest with you, if we could establish it if we're establishing it beyond reasonable doubt and an appeals process was functional, then I have no real issues with death per se. You could probably win us over to death if you really tried.
Well, but yeah, my point is these processes don't exist, right? So I'm not really interested in like constructing a hypothetical legal system that if everything works well, then people get what they're due or whatever. That's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in constructing legal systems as they exist.
We know that there's a risk-reward ratio with any sentencing. There can be erroneous convictions. There can be obviously people can be framed. There's loads of stuff that can obviously take precedent when we're talking about punishments. That doesn't mean that we should do away with justice. It just means that we have to accept a certain risk-reward ratio. And I just think that erroneous convictions which lead to death give a very limited span from which we can then reinvestigate the crime. And it gives people who are willing to participate, who are actually actively willing to try and prove the innocent of a erroneously convicted party a lot longer to do so. And it also gives people it also takes the power of people like Donald Trump and castrates it, when they're trying to, essentially kill people en masse before they leave political office. I think another big worry for me is political assassination. It's genuinely terrifying that, let's say, someone who necessarily, you get framed for a crime and, to be entirely honest with you, people have been framed for crimes for far less than being political adversaries, unfortunately. You get people who just get bullied into confessions and stuff. I mean, I would point towards, for example, I know you mentioned Norway before, and obviously, obviously the rates of criminal activity in Norway, I think, can not be boiled down to the fact that the criminal justice system is very rehabilitative, but rather the fact that their economy and the size of their nation is disgustingly disproportionate compared to most. And since we can track the size of a nation and the size of a city directly with the number of crimes, I mean, we're looking, Norway's got a population of 10 million people. I think
What does the population have to do with the crime rate?
It's directly correlated. Increased percentage, like as population density increases, so does increases of various crimes, including homicide.
We're not talking about, well, population density isn't, like, if you look at like Honduras, right? I mean, Honduras is a fairly small city, very, very high crime rate, right? Like highest murder rate in the world.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's
I agree that, I mean, density has something to do with it, but it's not the total population of the country.
Yeah, but
it doesn't matter that Norway's a small country.
Population density in Norway is very small compared to the population density in many places. I mean, look, we can even point towards somewhere like Japan, which has an incredibly high population density, yet a lower homicide rate than Norway. So it's like, obviously this does break down. But what I'm really pointing towards is that the rates of homicides in any country have socio-political and economic factors that are so far-reaching that it would take like probably about 3 hours to cover all of them. I mean, we're talking about religion, population density, economic factors, relationships between social groups. There's loads of stuff going on. I mean, not even including like political groups and gang violence and like opportunities for organized crime. To be entirely honest with you, I think that this is why I would say the best way to deter crime is not to create a rehabilitative justice system, but rather ethically educate those individuals in the first place. Put money into social programs which essentially, fulfill the failures of things like the family. When children are neglected by their parents and they're not taught right from wrong properly, or when they're neglected by their school systems and they're not taught right from wrong properly. But ultimately, I think that almost every adult in Western civilization is taught that killing is wrong in some way or another, and can be held accountable for their actions.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think that most people. Okay, yeah, there's a lot there. So
that's fine.
Starting back from the earlier point about cross-nation comparisons, right? Transnational comparisons. These are difficult to do, of course. There are a number of factors. I mean, including how statistics are kept, that make these difficult. But surely, right? Like, in some sense, most countries, right? At least most peer nations, the United States, don't use life without parole. There's an exception. England's an exception. I think Australia is an exception. Germany is. But I'd say most of these countries don't do life without parole. So to the extent that, like, if there's a harm that you think that getting rid of life without parole is going to cause, right? Somewhere, right? We should do some kind of regression and find
any consideration.
What
I would not argue for life without parole for deterrence, public safety as a whole, or anything like that. I think that is
victim well-being.
The victim's dead.
With victims' families in this case, right?
Well, I don't think. Well, look, I think like in terms of the victims' families, in terms of restitution for the victims' families, I don't think giving a lump sum for the death of your relatives is necessarily restorative anyway. But even if it was, you can have life without parole you can have life without parole and restitution. The state can give their families a form of restitution for the harm done, whilst also permanently incarcerating that individual who's committed the crime. The point.
Sure. Nonetheless, do you not think that public spending has an opportunity cost? Do you think there's no opportunity cost?
Of course, I expect. I think everything in life has an opportunity cost. I mean, that's like economics 101, isn't it?
So being that that's the case, right? So any dollar that we spend, I think there's like 55,000 people in the United States locked up for life without parole, right? So any dollars that are spent there, right? And you mentioned kind of in the summary of my position that it was directing that money towards victim restitution. Not just that, right? It's also directing that money towards evidence-backed ways to prevent crime in the future, right? One of these, by the way, are rehabilitation efforts, but we can get into that.
Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't incarcerate anyone for like violent crimes. I think it's an absolute travesty that people are being incarcerated for non-violent crimes. If you committed fraud or anything like that and you're getting a prison sentence, I would see that as unjust.
Yeah, I mean,
so
okay.
when we talk about rehabilitation programs, I don't think that we should necessarily, the way that we're punishing, for example, in the first place, I don't think for example, the life without parole is almost exclusively far too large in the United States because it's you are giving people who do not deserve life without parole life without parole. So you're giving people who have not committed murder life without parole. You do not have to commit a violent crime to get life without parole, as far as I'm aware, in the United States, or at least virtual life. You can be given like 100. I think the guy that was it like cloud sharing website, was it like Pirate Bay? You got like 135 years. Like, that's absolutely disgusting. You cannot take someone's life like that because of a monetary crime.
Yeah, so just for that, so about 91% of the people who are incarcerated or who are serving life sentences in the United States are being incarcerated for violent crimes, but 57% of those are murder.
Yeah, so you're talking about 43,
are like
43
sex-related offenses.
Yeah, so 43%. I would argue 43% of those incarcerated in the United States for life without parole are unjustly incarcerated.
Well, that's fine, right? But
I mean, if you're talking about opportunity cost, I mean, if we're talking about the United States and its concrete opportunity cost, I think it's blowing money on that. Like, don't get me wrong, like you're essentially punishing people too harshly, but I think that's what, like, American conservatism.
There's not disagreement there.
1 second for both of you. I just wanted to. Normally, I just like making sure that we're all like on the same page with facts. I think you were both correct in regards to like we don't need non-violent offenses for in the U.S. about life without parole. I'm just going to read this like brief excerpt from the Wikipedia page on life imprisonment in the United States, just to make sure the audience understands. So under some controversial sentencing guidelines known as three-strike laws, a broad range of crimes ranging from petty theft to murder can serve as the trigger for a mandatory or discretionary life sentence in California in particular. Notably, the U.S. Supreme Court has on several occasions upheld lengthy sentences for petty theft, including life with the possibility of parole and 50 years to life, and stated that neither sentence conflicted with a ban on cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment. These court decisions have been the subject of considerable controversy. So I'll shut up again. Good, keep going.
Yeah, no. So certainly, right. So for example, like habitual offender laws, which are can take the form of 3 strikes, suspended always 3, are insane, right?
But
I think it's something like
I think
81% of the people who are incarcerated in Mississippi, and I mean they're racistly applied in general. Like 81% of the people who are incarcerated in Mississippi, where I mean it's insane. It's like I think it's like 2 crimes and one of them has to be a felony, or 2 felonies and one of them must be violent, or something like this. Like 81% are black, 61% of the people serving life without parole are black. Yeah, I mean, so these are. Then there's a huge amount of
so
discretion
the wrongful application of a just sentence.
Sure, I'm not concerned about these. Like, we both agree, right, that habitual offender laws, these things are bad. I'm not really concerned about these. So you're right to say there's a huge opportunity cost in incarcerating these people. I agree. We shouldn't be incarcerating. We shouldn't be giving them life sentences. But my point is, the point remains that when you want to use prisons as nursing homes, which is in essence what you're advocating for, that is a huge cost to the state, and every one of those dollars, we're not getting anything for any of those dollars, right? We're not helping the victim. You're right, as you pointed out, the victim's dead. It's really not clear that we're helping the victim's families.
It's not necessarily help for the victim's well-being. It's more about the restitution towards justice itself. That's the argument. So it's about maintaining the equality between individuals, and that they are worth exactly the same. That no individual's moral prerogative can take precedent over another's. So if
they're worth exactly the same. So what is that? So why not? If someone tortures somebody, why wouldn't we torture them?
Because the equality because one, I think that when we're talking about we would actually take an equivalent value from that individual. I think we would just do it in more sophisticated means. We wouldn't I think lower ourselves to barbaric means of essentially committing restitution. We would take their subjectivity from them in a way that is, well, to be entirely honest, I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we don't say that prison is in some way torture, which is,
it is.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of the, death by incarceration is what I'm saying. I think that is absolutely justified. And unless the individual wants to opt for execution. I mean, they're welcome to. If they would rather on moral grounds, and I would make this on moral grounds, I would allow them to die immediately. I just give them an infinite number of years to prove their innocence if they did believe they're innocent.
Sure. I don't really. I mean, I'm not really super concerned with. I mean, look. At the end of the day, the point is like some of this. I think is predicated on the idea that
if I can quickly just say, like, I think that the point is as well, like the idea of using punishment as a form of deterrence, as a form of rehabilitation, and as a form of I'm not going to need to say it again. Essentially, incapacitation. Thank you. Is perverse. I think that what you're looking towards is violating the rights of another individual for the proposed good of the state, and not necessarily to undo the wrong that was committed in the crime. It's not about...
You can't undo the wrong. There's no undoing the wrong, right?
Yes, you can.
What happened in the past?
Yes, you can. Yeah, no, you can't undo the crime, but you can right the wrong. You can establish the equality between individuals, which is essentially justice, which is why it's a scale.
Well, okay, so you... I mean, I guess you're gonna have to help me understand this. In what way does so again? In what way does keeping someone locked up for life, like keeping a bunch of elderly people in prison, in what way is this undoing harm to?
I mean, I say this. I mean, it's
like who's being harmed by this person? By this person.
I mean, the person
being paroled out.
I mean, it's an affront to justice itself. It's not an affront to just a given. It's an affront to what the state it means for the state to exist. So, like, look at it like this: what would you consider a wrong act? What do you think a wrong act is?
Murder is wrong.
But why?
Well, you're going to for an example?
Yeah, like why? People. Yeah, but why is harm wrong?
Why? I mean, why is harm wrong? I mean, I think it's sort of definitionally wrong. Like, it's like
but that's like saying like being rude is wrong, but it isn't necessarily so. It's like it's definitionally wrong. You would say that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to accept that it is actually wrong.
So to back up, 1 second.
Like you can't use a thick moral concept as a justification for what of an ethical for an ethical foundation. You can't go like, oh, like something is rude, so people shouldn't be rude, otherwise they are absolutely wrong. You can't just presuppose the wrongness of an act by saying, well, it's defined as wrong.
I don't really care to get into like a meta ethical debate
I think
here, because at the end of the day, hold on. Let me talk about it.
Yeah.
So I mean, at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is public policy. Philosophy matters for public policy, but I don't see this why we should treat
what we're talking
the justice
about
system
is justice.
any different than. I don't see why we should treat the justice system, which is which is a public policy enacted by the state.
If you have no,
why we should treat this? Hold on. Why we should treat this any differently than we treat, for example, tax policy, right? So,
because
when
it's justice. Because look, I understand that you're taking a very liberal approach, and you look in things in economic terms, for example, and we can monetize everything in social life, and everything can be restored through understanding that individuals are reducible to economic terms, for example, opportunity.
I don't think people. Wait, hold on. I don't think people are reducible to economic terms.
Well, then why would we even consider opportunity cost in relation to like justice? We would say like, okay, justice takes precedence.
Because what I care about is people being harmed, right? What I care about.
Why did you bring up money?
Because we have some amount of funds, and we have to allocate those funds in a way that helps the most people.
So you're saying like, we just simply do not have the funds to do it. So like you're saying that we don't have the funds to allocate. If I made the point, just to give you an equivalent example within the same system, everyone is entitled to criminal defense. Right? Right. Now that requires a certain amount of funds. If we didn't have the funds to give people criminal defense, that wouldn't mean that there was a problem with the concept of criminal defense. It means that we need to find a way to find the funds. Because justice, the state presupposes a level of justice to function. That's why justice is essential. And that's why it's separate from tax policy.
Okay, but at the end of the day, right? So the economy is a real thing. We're talking about raising funds. We're talking about moving economic activity from one location to another, right? But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is allocating resources. How best to allocate resources to make the greatest happiness for everybody.
Yeah,
right?
well, no, that's utilitarian, and this is what I was expecting, just essentially liberal utilitarianism. Essentially, you're presupposing a justice, which is just the greatest good for the greatest number. And I ask you what the greatest good is,
I
want
to help people, right?
And then you say harm.
I don't really care. I don't really care about these abstract ideas.
No. What are you talking about? Abstract ideas. What are you talking about? When you're talking about helping people, it's going to be. Look at it like this.
Hold on. One second. All right. So, we're gonna do one at a time. We're gonna let Chad speak for a minute, and we're gonna let Lewis speak for a minute. All right? No, please don't interrupt the other person. I just can't hear either of you right now. That was like I was getting the wait meme. But all right, so Chad first, and then Lewis.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like what you're telling me, right? Is that because of this like abstract ideal of justice, that we need to keep a bunch of 60-year-olds in cages, despite the fact that not keeping them in a cage doesn't, or even giving them the opportunity to leave the cage, does no harm to anyone. You're telling me we need to keep a bunch of 60-year-olds in cages. And by the way, again, and this is crucial because we cannot separate the application of the law from the law itself. We need to keep a bunch of 60-year-olds in cages where they're being abused by other prisoners and being abused by guards. I don't care about your like abstract ideal of justice.
Well, they can peace out anytime.
This is what it leads to, right? This is what it leads to. If it leads to us not having the budgets to prevent future victims from existing, for not having funds to prevent future victims from existing, and functionally torturing people for no purpose.
Actually, there is a purpose, and that's justice. And you say it's an abstract ideal, but I think that's absolutely vile that you would violate somebody's human rights, and you'd violate them for what? For some abstract notion of the public good. What would you imprison certain statistically prevalent groups who would commit crime? Would you prevent people from being of certain religions if they're associated with certain crimes? It's absolutely disgusting that you would even consider that punishment should be done for any other means than righting a wrong. This is why utilitarianism
is wrong. We can't right this wrong. You can't right. I don't think the only reason. Wait a minute.
I'll let you speak. I'll let you speak.
Okay, yes,
Look, right.
Please let him go.
Like when we talk about, let's say, utilitarian notions of justice and let's say goodness, you are presupposing a notion of right and wrong already. You are already saying harm is bad. And then I say, why is harm bad? And you're like, it's definitionally bad. Oh, and I'm like, oh, well, what does it mean to harm someone? You're like, oh, well, essentially it's a moral judgment given by that individual. So if two individuals have a discrepancy about the moral judgment, how is it supposed to be essentially determined to be right or wrong? Now, that's where we appeal to an indifferent court of justice. We appeal to the universal that exists between multiple individuals in their judgments of good. Okay? And that's why when an individual commits a crime and they impede the moral agency of another, they essentially prevent an individual from obtaining certain goods in their life, or in the case of murder, annihilate their life as a whole. They are indebted not just because of the damage they've done, but because of the conceptual rejection of the victim themselves. They have narcissistically, egoistically discarded what the other individual's judgment means and its essentiality towards what the state is, which is the universal identity of all of its inhabitants. And so that value of their judgment, that value that exists in all of the agents within the state, must be maintained at all cost for the state to function. If you reject the value of one given individual, absolutely, then you have taken a master-slave approach and you are trying to propose a notion of justice onto itself. You are saying, I am the law. I am greater than the law. And that is why we crush criminals in that respect.
I mean, why is that? How is murder qualitatively different there? I mean, anytime you commit a crime, you're saying you're above the law, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
but murder is the absolute rejection of another individual's judgment. And actually, if you look, there are I think you can separate crimes into three different forms: unintentional wrong, you could unintentional wrong, deceitful wrong, and violently criminal wrong. And I think violent criminals are the ones who atypically reject the interests of the other party, the judgment of the other party in relation to morals the most, which is why when we try to abstract what is good for all of these parties. I think it's absolutely disgusting that you would say, oh, well, when we talk about, what is good for everyone, well, you're only talking about what is good for only a certain number of the population, namely everyone who isn't the victims who are no longer here. You're saying, okay, now that the victim's dead, what is in the interests of those people who are alive? And we no longer consider those individuals in their moral judgments.
Wait, so what matters is the interests of the victim who's dead. So suppose I declare right now that if someone murders me, I don't want them to be locked up for prison. I don't want them to get life in prison. Does that factor in? Does that matter?
Well, I mean, it's got to be indifferent. I would say. I'd say like it's not just like. So when we talk about moral judgments, the separation between the moral and the right is the indifference of the judge. That's why we would say who judges right and wrong is separate to who judges, let's say, good and bad. It's like let's say someone commits a crime against me and I say I forgive you. But let's say I've got Stockholm syndrome, right? Or I've got some sort of psychological bias that's preventing my rationality. Then an unbiased judge should step in and say, actually, no, they're going to be punished regardless.
Oh, one second, Chad. Lewis, if you could just briefly explain to the audience, also to me, I'm a bit lost, the difference between right and wrong versus good and bad. If you could do that.
Yeah, so good and bad is, let's say, the individual's moral evaluation with the world and objects within the world. So it's what they would consider to be the end goal of their actions, how the world that they are trying to create with their actions. Right and wrong would be the universal conception of good and bad, that which is that the overlap between all moral agents, that which sustains people's moral agency within the state. So essentially, I can only make moral judgments and I can only engage in moral judgments if I'm in a relationship of mutual recognition in terms of value with other individuals within the state. And this is ethics. This is where we talk about morality at an institution. It becomes an institutional level. So the supersedence of morality to ethics is the movement from an individual's judgment to an objective, indifferent judgment, which universally obtains all agents as well. The value of everyone.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And, that's why we need to lock 60-year-olds in cages.
Well, I mean, to be entirely honest with you, I would, again, as you said, as I said before, I'd happily be one round to capital punishment. I'm just saying that people can essentially determine whether they want to live in prison for the rest of their lives versus, ending their lives painlessly.
Yeah. Okay. So once again, I mean, let me circle back again to this notion of erroneous conviction. So why is it? I mean, why isn't erroneous conviction the possibility of erroneous conviction? Because I mean, so you're expecting someone who's in prison, likely has relatively, most people who are in prison, don't come from particularly wealthy backgrounds, generally pretty poor, generally have few resources. So I'm a little bit confused here.
No, I think everyone is entitled to propose defense, and if they want to make an appeal, I think there should be an appeals process, of course. Like, I'm not barbaric in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, true. But the reality is, right? I mean, you're entitled to an appeals process. You're not necessarily entitled to a really good lawyer. Train your lawyers better. I don't know. What do you want us to say? What I want to say is that, like, at the end of the day, okay, we can talk about whatever these again very abstract notions of justice, especially since it's a little bit strange that
at least I don't see how my version of justice is abstract when my version of justice is about the judgments of individuals.
I'm pointing to like a very real material, material.
Very real
harm that's happening.
Okay, guys, stop you later. Yeah, keep going. Sorry, Lewis first, and then Chad.
It's just that when you say mine's abstract, but then you use words which you say are self-evident, or rather, it's defined as good. So you're just presupposing it. You're like, oh yes, this is good. This is just. This is what justice is. This is what. But you're just asserting it. I'll defend everything I say. If you don't have a theory of justice, that's fine. We can debate again.
Yeah, no, my point is that, like, when we again lock a bunch of 60-year-olds in cages, which is what life without parole is, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, actually, it's locking people from the ages of 18 plus.
Well, this is the difference between life without parole and a shorter sentence.
Well, I mean,
right?
you can be 18 and have a life without parole sentence, right?
the difference in the population of people who are locked up between whether you gave them life without parole or not is that you're keeping people locked up throughout their entire lives. The differential is those years at the end, right? If it were a shorter sentence, they wouldn't be locked up for the years at the end.
Okay.
Right? So that's the difference.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think old people are not deserving of punishment?
It's not I think that old people. I mean, it's not that I don't think that old people in general are deserving of punishment. But it's far from clear for me that there's much of a reason to keep someone locked up who committed a crime 40 years ago, or at least not given the in this case I'm not even arguing against life sentences, although I maybe would in a different debate. The point here is in part the point of a parole process is in some sense it combats against this fear of erroneous convictions, right? Because the idea is you continually have an ability, even if you can't, right? You can't necessarily prove that you didn't do it, and you can't always do that, right?
Parole is not a way to prevent erroneous conviction. Parole is a way of letting people out.
It's a way to mitigate the harm of erroneous conviction.
No. Parole is a way of reducing the sentence. That's all it is. It's not necessarily so you can accept someone being guilty. Like, so you would the state would be like, you are guilty. We are going to consider you guilty, and now we are going to let you out early because of quote unquote good behavior, which is really just a functional definition of your quote unquote rehabilitation, which has nothing to do with, let's just say, repentance, actually accepting you are wrong. It has everything to do with
that's usually part of a parole process.
No. The parole process, in the sense of rehabilitation, is usually if you are rehabilitated, then you have the possibility of release, which is a perverse incentive. You now have the option of no longer. You're not actually looking to see whether people are actually sorry and have metaphysically modified themselves, as absolutely rejected their past actions in an act of conscience, and changed their behaviors to be.
Wait, no, that's absolutely part of repentance. That's absolutely part of the parole process. Wait
a minute.
Right, that's absolutely
wait a minute. And like, you may propose that it might be part of it, but by giving the incentive of early release, you are saying if you say X, Y, and Z, if you behave as if you are sorry, then we will let you out despite whether you are sorry or not. They are performing these actions not necessarily to come to terms with the unethical nature of their crime, but rather to get out of prison. It can be the same narcissistic, egotistical actions which led them to prison, which can lead to their release.
I mean, you're right that it can be. I don't really know what to say.
I will say, actually, it might be worth mentioning, I do accept clemency. Pardons make sense. If an individual has absolutely changed to...
Wait, why is clemency okay, but pardons aren't?
No, pardons make sense. Well, clemency...
Why is clemency okay, but parole isn't?
Well, I'll explain. So there is a separation in seeing an individual as something to be reconditioned, essentially pitiable and not responsible for their actions, not deserving of punishment because they're such an infant that they didn't know that the harms that they were doing. I would say that if they didn't know the harms that they were doing, then they shouldn't have been they shouldn't have been convicted of murder. But we'll get onto that in a second. An individual who's given clemency, if they've genuinely changed and it can be seen that they've changed and has had no expectation of forgiveness. There's no reason for them to appeal to some sort of higher power in order to get early release. If they are genuinely sorry and remorseful, prison staff are shown that they're remorseful. There is maybe even an objective test in the sense that, we'll look at their behavior, wouldn't necessarily manufacture situations even to see how they react in relation to other individuals. If that person shows themselves to be truly repentant, there is no obligation for the state to offer them a pardon or offer them clemency, but it would be virtuous if they did. It would be good. And this is where you get, like, for example, when Kierkegaard talks about the teleological suspension of the ethical, I wouldn't call it a suspension as much as I would say elevation. This is where we can say that an individual can and has modified themselves to the point in which they are an entirely new person. They can be forgiven and the debt be wiped out. They committed the crime, but we no longer hold them accountable for that debt. That's a state can do that. I have no problem with that if the individual's repentant.
The difference between parole, just to be clear, the difference between parole and clemency in your view, is that there's an expectation of parole.
Yeah, there's an expectation that an individual
Surely, if
and
clemency
also
is used,
and also
but surely if clemency is used, right? It's a matter of rarity then, right? Because surely if clemency is used with any frequency, people have an expectation of clemency that if
they might have a
X
hope
thing,
of it.
like
I mean, you can always hope for mercy, but at the end of the day, the mercy is based on the virtue of a state, not necessarily.
How is the process here different than parole then?
Because it's how you are not obligated, in the sense that like
you're not obligated to be paroled.
I'd say that rehabilitation is, as in like the process of rehabilitation, is often fairly perverse. I think that we'll actually see, and the way that prisons work as a whole is actually fairly perverse. The manipulation of people's very minor behavior into disciplinary patterns to make them essentially docile is the goal of prison. And so when we parole
you think prisons currently are too rehabilitative?
I don't think that prisons are too it depends on what you mean.
What do you think is done in prisons right now for that serves rehabilitation?
Like
you want some civic stuff?
It's not necessarily that prisons are too rehabilitative. It's that when we talk about rehabilitation, really what we typically mean is essentially turning someone into an individual who commits, who functions within society.
What do you think prisons do right now? What do you point to specifically?
Well, I would actually point towards, let's say, the basic function in terms of inmates are given the same clothing.
What does that have to do with rehabilitation?
No. We'll talk about just prisons as a whole. Prisons essentially.
No, you said that this
I think
this focus on rehabilitation is leading us to like make prisoners docile, whatever. That's
I'm saying that prisons in general, like the way that they take a delinquent population and essentially try to convert them into profitable members of society or somewhat profitable members of society when they leave, is it done for the purpose of a social class?
What does that have to do with prisons wearing the same clothes? Like I'm asking, what specifically do prisons do to prisoners?
How discipline works.
Yeah.
I mean,
wait. I'm fairly certain, if I can cut through this for a second. I'm fairly certain Lewis is just saying that the process of making everyone wear the same clothes, everyone eats the same food, everyone stays in the same sort of conditions, is part of the process of converting these people into the docile members. And again, this is just me describing his position. I might
that is exactly. I mean, it's quite a Foucauldian. I'm basically arguing for quite a Foucauldian position. If you know Foucault.
If you could briefly, I do not. If you could briefly, if there's a big philosopher term or philosophy thing, if you could explain that for me and the audience, that would be awesome. Because I am.
It's just basically.
I did my undergrad in philosophy, but this shit's I haven't touched this in so fucking long.
Well, Foucault essentially, in terms of how he outlines the prison, essentially shows that the actions of the prison guards and the way that the prisoners are treated are essentially done to modify small behaviors to allow for the psychological manipulation of those in the actual prison system. It's to create a class of individuals who fulfill a certain goal, rather than necessarily create ethical education. I think that rehabilitation in this. If it was just purely ethical education, if you were to say that if you're going to define rehabilitation as teaching people right and wrong, I have no problem with people doing ethics classes in prisons. It's when they're doing ethics classes in prisons specifically for the goal of clearing a parole hearing for essentially getting released. That is the perverse incentive there. If you want to teach prisoners ethics, that's fine.
I think this first incentive exists with clemency just as much as if clemency is used with any frequency, unless what you're saying is that it should just be very rarely used. There's no expectation. If clemency is used with any frequency,
well, I mean, it should only be used if the individual can be shown to have genuinely changed, as if there is an objective measure.
Then why can't we just put that in? Why can't we just put whatever this objective process that you want? Just put that into the parole.
Well, I mean, because it's not necessarily so there was no necessary. There's no need to forgive them. If you don't want to forgive them, then you don't have to. It's very nice. It's supererogatory. It's not an obligation.
So then again, I don't understand that. I don't understand the difference. There's no obligation to grant someone's parole hearing. Yeah, so I don't understand. I don't understand the distinction that you're drawing here.
So the parole hearing is essentially the fact that the individual's sentence will be
not if it's not granted.
But it will be reconsidered at specific times. There is no need to if we have accepted that the individual has committed the crime, we aren't considering their I don't care about their behavior in prison, right? If they're absolute assholes, I don't care, right? Essentially sort them out in prison. Have a prison system which treats people who commit those crimes harsher. Throw them into like I genuinely do not
solitary.
Like look if they won't mix with inmates, then they can put themselves in solitary. I don't care.
Is there like do either of you? This is a question for both of you. Is there say like a varying degree of, because you both agree that prison is like some flavor of torture, right? Is there
solitary confinement is
absolutely
right?
Inhumane.
General torture. Solitary confinement is
worse, right? So like I guess is like a spectrum of say like acceptable torture in prison for either of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we come to the point in which an individual was so antisocial that they were, let's say raping inmates or something like that, committing acts of violence, even murders in prison, and could not be housed, I would say execution.
Chad, if you could briefly respond as well, just to make sure I can get your position on this.
I mean, solitary confinement has some very limited use for very short durations to sort of cool people off. But in general, denying people, like, I think what you're missing is that when you set up these institutions where you say that, like, for someone who's displaying antisocial behavior, we should continue to treat them worse and worse and worse, and then eventually we'll execute them. I mean, you're kind of missing that there's like that cause and effect flows in both directions here, right?
I mean,
so
like,
when you take somebody, can you let me speak? Like,
no, sorry, go for it. Sorry.
Please, Chad, go
ahead. So when you lock somebody up, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Right, solitary confinement. We take someone who's already displaying antisocial behavior, and then you put them in a room for 23 hours a day. Giving them 1 hour a day where they're allowed to leave and go walk around in a very small cage outside. This drives people insane.
I agree. I do agree with that. I think especially.
Please let Chad finish.
Sorry, I was just saying I do agree that sorry.
Yeah. So the problem with like the notion that once they're prison, if they're not if they're not following the rules or being however docile you want them to be, that you're just going to continue to treat them harsher and harsher. This is a feedback loop.
No, it's more of like it's more about essentially what would you do with someone who is otherwise going to rape and murder other inmates.
So someone who's, I mean, the answer still isn't deny them all human contact.
What would you do if someone is going to rape and murder anyone they come into contact with?
I mean, then you put a wall between the two. You put a glass wall between the two of you, and you try to have counseling, these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But again, like these people don't really exist. Like,
what do you mean these people don't exist? So, for example, let's look at the people who are filling.
Wait.
Sorry, I'll let Chad finish. I'll let Chad finish.
So these like Jeffrey Dahmer type people.
This is fun. I didn't expect this to get so spicy. This is cute. All right, go both of you. Go. Sorry, Chad, go first, and then
Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, these kinds of people, they exist, but they're infinitesimal. Like, even if we're talking people who commit murder, right? Most people who commit murder are like either paranoid schizophrenics, because when we ended mental institutionalization in this country, which was a good thing, we didn't scale up the community-based mental health at the same time, and so prisons in large part have replaced mental institutions. So a lot of people who end up in prison are some flavor like paranoid schizophrenic, for example, or they were so high off their mind when they committed the crime that they had a very loose connection to what they were actually doing. But the point is, the point is that like these it's very easy to go to these like, well, what if someone is just irreconcilable and they just like every time they see somebody they just rape them, and they just can't get that's just what they do. There's nothing you can't reason with them. They're just so they're not mentally incompetent for any mental health care treatment. They're just a coldly rational individual that just wants to rape and murder everyone they sees. I mean, we can like contrive these people. They don't. That's like
they do exist. Yeah, they do, and they actually like look at the end of the day. Oh God, I don't know. I mean,
oh, sorry. He's back. 1 second.
Do we want to do like closing statements and Q&A? Because I have to go soon.
Oh, okay. Oh shit. Where'd he go? All right. Yeah. Oh.
Hello.
Lewis, you back? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Really sorry about that, guys. I don't know what's going wrong. I think I was telling you beforehand that I was having problems with my capture card.
Yeah. No problem at all. I saw you. After you dipped, I went and checked your YouTube channel and like it was down there, so I knew you didn't like just randomly like bug out. So.
Yeah. Like me computer overheated with me. Okay. So Last thing I remember was speaking about, I'm not going to be able to be a face.
That's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Lewis, I just want to let you know, Chad does have to go soon. Would you guys be comfortable maybe chatting for like 10 more minutes, and then we do like a brief Q&A, and then closing statements, and we can be out of here.
Sure.
And we can be out of here by like in 25, 30 minutes. Is that okay, Chad? Okay, cool. All right. All right, go ahead. Again, 10 more minutes of uninterrupted convo. And then everyone in my chat, if you have questions for either Chad or Lewis, start adding me in the chat. And so we can have a list so we can start asking them rapid fire during the Q&A portion, so we don't have to wait for that. So if you have any questions for either of our guys, make sure you put it, just put my name as an @ and then if you have a specific question for one of them, put their name. But if you want to ask both of them, just leave it blank. I hope that makes sense. You can all follow instructions because I have no faith in chatters, but like you guys are gonna do just fine. But sorry, you two go back to where you were going.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I remember you saying was essentially that the people in the prison system who do commit these crimes and who are super antisocial are mentally ill. I think that's just the medicalization of evil. I think that you can actually find people who are sound of mind and who are horrible, horrible people.
What does sound of mind mean?
Essentially capable of making rational decisions without diminished responsibility. And the UK will have various tests for that. So I can go through it with the separation between, let's say, what would be diminished responsibility. So, for example, would ask, was the defendant suffering from abnormal functioning? Did it arise from a recognized mental health condition? If so, was the impaired rational judgment, did it impair rational judgment or self-control? If so, does it provide an explanation for the conduct? And this would lead to a conviction not of murder, but of manslaughter in the UK. Then you've got the test for loss of self-control, which is 1, that self-control was lost. 2, was there a qualifying trigger? And 3, you provide an objective test from mental health institutions within recognized fields. And it's even made in such a way in the UK as to allow for the development of new and more recognized mental health conditions within the DSM-5 and onwards. So I don't see why you would even reference people with mental health conditions when we.
Oh, because we do, right? So because like.
That's a
because in practice,
please let Chad respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, because in practice, we do end up with a bunch of, like, for example, like people on death row who are paranoid schizophrenics, or one thing this doesn't account for again. I would argue that there's that someone who is high out of their minds on meth, and killed somebody, that's awful, and they certainly bear much more responsibility than someone who was mentally ill for a reason that wasn't their fault, right? In some sense, sometimes you chose to take the drug list initially, and this also represents a number of people who end up committing murder, right? People who 40 years ago took too much of a drug and ended up killing somebody. You generally not you don't get like NGI for that.
I mean, if you want us to argue that, I mean, I'm happy to say that people who necessarily commit crimes when they're mentally ill, if it did pass these tests, that would be manslaughter in the UK. So I wouldn't even consider that murder. So they wouldn't be eligible for life without parole. I would say that they need essentially psychological treatment, like psychiatric treatment. That's not the same. That's not the same thing. If you're saying that some people do accidentally get put through the system, yeah, like erroneous convictions happen. But that's the way that criminal justice system works. Unfortunately, there are erroneous convictions. That doesn't mean that we can't convict people of crimes.
No, it doesn't. Hold on. But one of the things, your justification for life sentence was because it's in some sense, or life sentence or death, right? That it's an infinite punishment. In order to make up for an infinite crime. Well, if that's the case, right? Then any even small probability, if it's an infinite punishment, any even small probability of erroneous conviction, that's a huge deal, right? It's a finite punishment. Okay, maybe we can reason about it, right? Finite punishment multiplied by a small probability. Okay, that's a finite number, right? But if we're talking about an infinite punishment multiplied, it doesn't even matter how small the number is, right? Because then you end up with an infinite loss every time you erroneously convict somebody.
Well, I mean, that would only apply. One, it would also arrive with an infinite loss on the opposite side every time you don't convict someone that was actually a murderer. So you can't just apply maximin reasoning to this and expect actually, so as long as we don't convict people who've committed these crimes, that we will have an infinite surplus, because that's absolutely wrong. Because
the sort of Blackstone adage that upon which both of our countries' justice systems are based, right, is that you'd rather see 10 innocent men go free, 10 guilty men go free than 1 innocent man be convicted. I absolutely think that's true, right? So
this is about essentially this is why we would then break. I mean, this is where when it breaks down into rival modes of rationality, and this actually exists within the United States itself between, let's say, the Democrats and the Republicans, with maximin reasoning. Liberals typically, like John Rawls, in terms of that theory of justice, look towards maximizing the minimum possible outcome for any individual within society. Well, that's presupposing a liberal form of rationality to come to a liberal conclusion. That's the issue. It was essentially destroyed by Alistair McIntyre and Robert Nozick. So you can look at that.
Sure. I'm not really here to debate Rawls, I don't think. But
I mean, it's the same rationality, isn't it? It's liberal rationality.
Sure.
Maybe we can have a chat about Rawls. I actually like Rawls. Sorry, go ahead. Fuck. I'm moderating. I'm moderating. No, maybe I am a liberal. But go ahead, Chad.
So no, I mean, my point is that to the extent this is a very serious punishment, right? This is an infinite punishment. Then we need then, in my view, if there's any probability of erroneous convictions, right? Us handing out an infinite punishment, then erroneously, then it seems to me that we shouldn't hand it out. So this is what I was saying earlier when I said that that parole in some sense mitigates, right, erroneous convictions, right? I'm not saying that the purpose of parole, right? I'm not saying that's what's considered, right? What's at issue in a parole hearing isn't whether you committed the crime. It's presupposed that you did. But what I'm saying is that in practice, right, what parole does is it mitigates some of the underlying error that exists in the justice system, right? So
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. But I would argue, one, you can't just appeal like, okay, like if there's an infinite punishment, if we deal that out, we're always at an infinite loss, because if we don't deal it out, then arguably we get an infinite loss as well. That's the whole point of it being a debt scenario. Like if the debt goes unpaid, if the debt essentially is not rebuked, then the debt is left outstanding. Then the murderer hasn't been brought to justice.
Yeah, this notion of debt also it seems to me to be quite confused. So I'm not sure entirely what I mean. Debt, you don't mean in a legal sense. You mean in like a moral sense, right?
I mean in a moral sense. Well, I mean in an ethical sense, actually.
Okay, sure. So it's a little bit strange, right? Because the way that we typically deal with debts to dead people is that debt is then in some sense like transferred to their family members. Once they die. So it's a little bit, so in that sense, like I'm wondering, who we pay, because we're not paying debt to them, right? When you're paying your sentence, the debt isn't, it's to society, right? It's not you're not paying a debt.
But society and the individual should be one and the same. It's the universal identity.
After the person's dead?
In general.
Okay.
See, this is why I think that it's absolutely disgusting to even talk about punishing people. Like if you genuinely believe that the individual's not a member of the society, I think that's just a discard for the victim. You've discarded the identity of the victim within the criminal justice procedure if you see that they're not a member of society once they're dead. And that's my problem with this notion.
I mean, I think this is one of those things where the words to I think we're using words, we're equivocating on like what society means. I mean, I would say society, like, I mean, my conception of society would not include like Abraham Lincoln. I don't think that Abraham Lincoln is like part of our society.
I would absolutely.
The idea of Abraham Lincoln maybe, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. Like,
we might have to put a specific word in this. I think we're going to move to the Q&A. It's going to be briefer out of respect for Chad's time. I have a couple of questions from chat, and then I want both of you to consider preparing a closing statement. I'll give you each about 5 minutes. I'll let Lewis go first, and then Chad can finish us up. So, first primary question. I think this was already answered, but this is from Wilkins for Perspective Philosophy or Lewis. So, in a hypothetical world where everyone can be fully rehabilitated, would you still hold the view instances of in which life or parole shouldn't be on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying that people can't change their behaviors and become new and better individuals. I absolutely accept that. And I think that an individual who does become a new and better individual should understand why they are being punished and actually desire that punishment. I think that they would see that as the restitution with the debt that they have taken, that my life is now forfeit for the life that I've stolen from another. I wouldn't see it as necessarily a means to egoistically obtain some sort of value within their own life, to express their own morality over the ethics of the state. They would accept the judgment. If they did end up in that scenario, then if the state wanted to offer them clemency, I don't have an issue with that either. I think that in those scenarios, that is a very nice thing to do. I don't think that it happens all that often. I think that what we find is that people who are severely antisocial don't necessarily have a moral revelation, upon, the everyone in prison, funnily enough, just finds the face of God as soon as they realize that it's going to help them get out. But I would say that it's a perverse incentive. I think that if the individual does accept that they've committed a wrong action, they would desire the punishment. And if the state wants to then offer them a pardon as a virtuous and lovely thing to do, then yeah, that's great. Supererogatory.
Can I ask one follow-up question to that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so if it's the case, right, that there's this epidemic of people who really haven't changed, who are just pretending they've changed and let out on parole, right? Particularly even in the case of let's say in the case of murder, for people who are let out with life without parole. I mean, the recidivism rate. You'd expect to see this in the recidivism rate, right? I mean, the recidivism rate, like for murder, is very, very low. It's like a third of what it is for other crimes.
No, I mean, like, look, if I've realized I can get caught once, I realize I can get caught again. So I don't think that's necessarily follows.
How can we ever tell if it's a legitimate change in character?
Well, I think that we can only just do our best to essentially judge that the individual is acting in such a way as to be a more ethical individual, that they are respecting fellow inmates, that they are genuinely sorry for the crime that they have committed, that they've accepted that punishment and don't try to alleviate their crimes anymore. They actually see that they've done wrong, and then we could offer clemency. Okay. If we want, like it would be nice. No, it's right. There's a separation. There is no expectation. There is no need for this to happen. The individual criminal cannot ask for the forgiveness. I wouldn't say that they should be able to put themselves forward for the hearing. I don't think that the hearing should necessarily entail any concepts about how they would interact when they get back into society, or notions of public safety. Or anything like that. I think that's perverse. I think that it ultimately is essentially justifying the violation of another individual's. So if the individual was genuinely, let's say, like hadn't committed murder or something, if you were to keep them in prison, just because you thought there would be a threat to society, you'd be punishing them for crimes that they haven't committed. So like these kinds of rationality, I would outwardly reject. I think that's absolutely disgusting.
Okay. All right. Next question. This is for Chad. If we take this from Based Plant, if we take the utilitarian approach, then would it apply to rehabilitation as well, or any consequences you would propose? Does that mean that your utility to society determines the consequences you get in regards to your sentences? And so those deemed less useful get more consequences as it's weighed in utilitarian calculus. I think like the example for that would be like, say, oh, hey, we have like a doctor whose research is like helping cure cancer versus say like, a random like asshole, like and they commit the same crime. Do we give like the doctor like a lighter sentence? Feel free to answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there'll be a lot of utilitarian justifications for why you shouldn't do this, but it mainly comes down to that it comes down to like that utility is intractable to calculate, right? So, generally, in general, it's intractable to calculate. So to say that like it's sort of impossible to know, any sort of objective measure that you even try to come up with someone's like value to society, strikes me that like it would be. I mean, it strikes me to be, it would have to be subjective enough to be relative to each individual, and then at that point, it's subject to all the usual like class and racial biases that you'd see that you see in our actual justice system. So it seems like, I mean, we don't design our institutions around these like individual cases like this, right? Like when we design institutions, we design rules.
Can I ask you a follow-up question as well?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you think that you can't calculate the utility in relation to sentencing, then why are you a utilitarian? Like, if you think that it's abstract and not useful.
I'm not saying that utility is abstract and useful, rather the information is highly distributed, right? So it's very difficult to make. It's a similar argument to like why central planning is bad, right? Is that there's so much dispersed information throughout the world that to really try to like measure one person's value to society seems impossible to me. I mean, right? Whereas I can point to things like recidivism rates. I can point to things like, yeah.
It seems really clear cut though in the case of the doctor who's necessarily curing cancer or something like that. You would see that it's going to have a massive societal impact. So why would you even say that it wouldn't even be calculable? It's like,
not necessarily, right? Because what you're essentially doing there, right? So you
like 100 people. If you save 10 million people, a utilitarian can't say the difference between, let's say, a car accident necessarily and a car in terms of moral value, a car accident and an intentional act, except for the recommittance of the crime, right?
Right. Yes, the recommittance of the crime is the key part, right?
So if he kills 100 people, but he saves 10 million, that's a straight like bonus utility, man.
That's true, but you also have to consider. So imagine we lived in a world in which like impulse than other people, right? For one, I mean, clearly this would have perverse effects on economic inequality. Certainly you see the extent to which like punishment deters, which long sentences don't really, but the certainty of getting caught. And so if it was the case that like we just let off people, functionally we let off powerful people, from being held accountable for their crimes, then there's literally zero deterrent effect if you're a powerful person. So there seems to be a number of like bad consequences that come from even attempting to do this kind of calculation and adjusting sentences based on their worth to society.
I mean, so if we could guarantee that nobody would find out that this person was released from prison, he could go and cure cancer, you would release him from prison.
Oh, like in the U.S., would I like hire the Nazi doctors? In that case, people knew, right? So it doesn't really work.
Yeah, it was like
in a world in which it never gets out, and so no other powerful. So how does the system work, right? Because then, so do other powerful people know?
It's just a hypothetical. It's
no,
like
yeah. So my point is like the problem with using these sorts of like moral intuitions, appealing in essence like moral intuitions in hypotheticals like this is that
I'm actually
like the things that you kind of flatten over with this hypothetical, right? Like the knock-on effects of, for example, what this means for other powerful people are precisely why are rejected, right?
Real life isn't a vacuum. I'm just asking you, in this vacuum, in this hypothetical, you would be okay with releasing the doctor?
Why couldn't I just have him remain incarcerated, be under house arrest, and continue to anything you do?
He'll only do it if he's released.
He'll only do it if he's released, and no one ever knows. And this is a one-off event, such that it's not part of like the institution itself.
Or just no one ever knows. I mean, Mill hypothetically proposed this in the first place in terms of capital punishment, because he was like, it would be better to have capital punishment than incarceration. And then he was like, oh, well, wait a minute, it would be better again if we just lied about it and put them all on an island and nobody ever found out.
But that can't happen, right? You can't put someone on an island and no one ever finds out.
Yeah, no, but I'm just asking you like the hypothetical. I mean, it probably would have been a lot easier in the time of John Stuart Mill.
Sure. So in this like again like contrived hypothetical, sure, I don't really have a problem with it, but this can't ever happen in real life. So I don't really care.
I don't think that an individual's value to society, and normally a certain class of individuals who will benefit, not the victims, has any bearing on that punishment.
I don't think it should. I don't think it should in real life. You mentioned like the class they're part of, and their economic class they're part of. Yeah, I agree. That's the problem.
Real life. Yeah, but the only
Right.
reason that you say it shouldn't in real life is because it wouldn't have that benefit for that class of
Well,
individuals.
and it would exacerbate those class inequalities, which is bad, right? So that's the problem.
Yeah. All right. Well, actually, I think respect for everyone's time.
Mhm.
We are going to move to the closing statements, and if you guys want to specifically maybe answer that question as well. There was one more question for Lewis, but maybe I know Chad has to go, so he can maybe answer that after we finish the closing statements.
Mhm.
So 5 minutes closing statement. Please don't interrupt each other. We'll start with perspective philosophy, and if you want to plug yourself, tell people where to find you. At the end of that, you're welcome to as well. I will give you a signal at this means 3 minutes, like 3, and then I'll give you this, which means 1 minute. All right, just to make sure, try and keep it under the 5 minutes. I was fine with the opening statements going a little bit long, but let's try and keep these ending ones maybe a bit more concise. So 5 minutes on the clock. Lewis, go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the debate. Probably maybe a bit spicier than I think either of us intended, but at the same time, enlightening. I would say that overall, I reject the sort of liberal thinking. I think that an individual's value to society has no bearing on that punishment in terms of deterrence, public safety, or essentially, anything that is not an attempt to restore the relationship between the two parties that was essentially violated. Since that relationship cannot be restored through normal restitution because of the qualitative difference in murder to other crimes, namely the infinite harm that it does to a party, the only restitution can be the life of the criminal. That essentially reinstalls the equality between agents. Now, if the individual decides that they would rather spend life in prison than necessarily have death, then that's fair enough. They get all the time they want and have an appeals process and the ability to engage in criminal justice as much as they want. I think that is absolutely expected, and I think everyone has the right to that. On top of that, I think that the individual should be allowed to die if they so please. It's obviously up to themselves. Like if they don't want to live in society anymore, or in prison rather anymore, then that's fair enough. And there's nothing that I think that we should necessarily do to stop them. In terms of erroneous convictions for life without parole, I think that it is a problem, and I think that's a problem that we should fix in terms of how we are actually engaging in legality, not necessarily with the problem of life without parole. I see that the issue of sending someone in prison for 20 years for a crime they didn't commit is absolutely atrocious, same as 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. It might get worse and worse as it goes on, but ultimately there is going to be error in a criminal justice system, and that is a risk we are going to have to take. I would push back on the promotion of liberal reasoning in this, that we should go for maximin reasoning and try to maximize the minimum, especially since it's only maximizing the minimum of those who are still alive. And the total disregard of the identity of the victim, I think, is narcissistic and egotistical, and I think shows the foundations from which this kind of criminal justice system really sees itself, which is a form of social contract egoism, in which the only thing that is considered about the parties is really their relationship to the fulfillment of each other's desires. Everyone uses each other as a means to an end, rather than actually establishing their identity as a universal. And I think that it ultimately leads to perversion or disgusting conclusions. On top of that, I think that why I would argue for life without parole specifically, like not having parole, is because no party can either expect forgiveness or necessarily no party is even entitled to a process which allows them to become free at any point. There is no reason for that to be baked into the procedure. If we want to look at criminals and see if they've changed and if they've become better people and offer forgiveness, that is very nice. It can only be done by an indifferent state who has, essentially the same power to convict as it is to forgive. Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's essentially mercy. And I think that it's a suspension of the ethical for a higher form of goodness. So yeah, that's fine, but ultimately not necessary. It's not obligatory, rather. In terms of the cost of criminal justice, I think criminal justice itself is very costly in general. I hope people commit less crimes, and I think that the best way we can prevent that is prevent the incarceration of petty criminals who don't necessarily commit violent crimes. I think prevent the poor education of individuals, which leads to high rates of criminality. Prevent things like poverty and so on, which leads to safer societies. And we can do that whilst funding a criminal justice system that is fair and respects all the parties involved, whether they're alive or not. I think that this idea that an individual has no value or had no value if they are murdered is absolutely vile. I think that it enforces the murderer's will as a law upon itself, that they are entitled to a level of well-being and freedom that the party that they have eliminated is not. And Chad, you point towards, you say, well, wait a minute, these people are rare. I would point towards criminals like Ian Brady, who, when asked whether he sexually assaulted a young girl before killing her, nearly decapitating her with a bread knife, I think it was, whether he sexually assaulted her, he said, of course I did. These people exist. They are horrible people, and we should punish evil like this with life without parole. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And everyone, I already shouted them out, but make sure you can find Perspective Philosophy on Twitter, YouTube, and are you on Twitch?
I am on Twitch, thank you.
I think I already, I did like the shout out, but I wasn't sure if that was you or some other channel, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, 5 minutes on the clock. Final words on this. Chad, go ahead.
You muted, mate.
Yeah, so surely, evil people, or people, certain people who have done evil things, exist, and to the extent that, you're worried about them getting out, that's not a reason to support life without parole. That's just a reason to deny them parole. Okay, so the point at the end of the day, right, is that life without parole leads to a whole bunch of bad stuff. And so, you can talk to your blue in the face about paying a debt to a dead person. When in my view, I mean, the way that to honor the person who's died, to honor the victim, right, is helping out their families as much as we can, right? You can't make them whole. Nothing can make them whole, right? That's one of the things that does bug me about this, is that a life sentence, the death penalty, whatever, makes no one whole. Nothing's being restored. You can't change the past. All we can do moving forward is to try to mitigate the harms that are done. In addition, so the existence of life without parole, the existence of this sort of, retribution-based framework of dealing with justice actually makes it harder to build the kind of justice system that perspective philosophy says he wants, right? So I touched on at the beginning, we never really got back to it, this notion of upward pressure. The fact that, as sentences, for murder, increased in the 90s, so too did sentences, for lesser crimes. And kind of the main, one of the major hypotheses pointed out for this is, again, this upward pressure, right? That the longest sentences serves as a kind of anchor point upon which the rest of the sentences are created relative to. So if you want, a justice system which, doesn't incarcerate, incarcerates people at a much lower rate, part of that has to be sentencing reform, maybe. And so, at the end of the day, the point is that this is a public policy. This is something that we're advocating resources towards, and these resources would be better spent, instead of turning our prisons into nursing homes, would be better spent, doing crime preventative measures, giving people addiction counseling, mental health counseling, putting money into the communities where crime is quite high, to increase the sort of material abundance there, which decreases crime in itself. At the end of the day, locking people up, it does come at a cost somewhere, right? At somewhere there is an opportunity cost. It's not me putting a price on anyone's life, but it is me putting a price on the active choice to keep a bunch of elderly people locked up for what seems to me to be very little reason. And so, to the extent that we're worried about erroneous conviction, that seems to me to be especially given what a poor position people who have been locked up for murder are in. It seems like a really kind of insane bar to me to say that, like, oh well, the way that we're going to get around this is either someone from the outside who has a lot of material wealth is going to have to like take pity on this person, put a lot of resources into helping them appeal or gathering evidence or these sorts of things. And these organizations exist. They're totally underfunded. The Innocence Project being one of them, though they mainly focus on death penalty cases. When it seems to me that a really great way of dealing with this probability of erroneous convictions is not handing out infinite punishments. Is to hand out lesser punishments, especially given that people, elderly people that would be letting out don't pose a risk to society. In fact, they can even benefit benefit other people. You can call me like, you can say this like liberal reasoning or whatever. To me, this reasoning sounds pretty reactionary. That there are just some evil people, and that we have to punish the evil people. If we can just find out who the evil people are, we can punish them. At the end of the day, the purpose, what I want to do is I want to help victims when the crime leaves them alive. I want to help victims' families. I want to help prevent crime, help the creation of future victims, and I see life without parole as a major obstacle of that. And that's why most countries, the International Criminal Court and the European Commission on Human Rights, are all against it.
Thank you so much, Chad. And where can everyone find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter, Chad Not Chud on Twitter, or my podcast that I run with Sid,
Nordic Model on YouTube?
At the Nordic Model on Twitter.
Hell yeah. Everyone make sure to follow those guys. Thank you both for overall what I consider a pretty respectful, good conversation. Thank you both for participating. And I really appreciate both of you being here. Chad, I know you said you had to go. There was one question from chat that I wanted to throw at Perspective Philosophy, but you're both under no obligation to stay if you have to dip. So this was from Chubby to Lewis. What do you think of Dworkin's theory that fundamental to justice is a principle of equal concern and respect for persons, and what this means in more concrete terms is the equal resources should be devoted to the life of each member of society, basically showing persons equal respect may sometimes require them equal treatment, even in the face of relevant ground for discrimination. I assume this is probably, say, like in the case of people committing maybe like more like heinous like crimes, right? This is a question I want to ask you as well. You talk about like murder being like an infinite amount of harm, right? Because like you've essentially like abolished that person's life, right? Like they're never coming back. Is there a fundamental difference to you in regards to, say, the murder of one person for sort of like the murder of multiple people? That's another question I wanted to ask.
I don't think that if you add infinity on to infinity, it's infinite, right? Like it doesn't necessarily change. Obviously the harm done is worse in the sense not to the state itself. I think the state itself, the harm done to the state is the same, in the same way that it would impact freedom, which is essentially not at all, because obviously as long as there are still members of the state, then the state still exists, unless it was like an act of war or something like that, then it changes things. But if it was just 5 people instead of 1 person, like trolley problem kind of odds as being essentially a more heinous crime, I think that it's deserving of the same punishment. Okay. And I mean, to be entirely honest with you, I think if there is a problem with the allocation of resources in terms of I think that the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, was how should we allocate resources in relation to justice? If we are treating all members of society as equal, are we not equally entitled to resource allocation? I would completely agree. I'm a socialist. I'm 100% going to say that we should distribute, when he talks about, for example, the allocation of resources being disproportionate in terms of justice, I would see that as an affront to justice itself. You should not be able to hire private legal authorities to do your bidding. You should have access to exactly the same as everyone else, and everyone should be considered equal in front of the law. And in that, everyone has equal facilities to engage within the law. If you think that the criminal justice system is therefore then underfunded, I would recommend paying more tax and promoting a higher tax system to fund that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm not going to push you anymore on that. That sounds like a pretty good response. Thank you so much. And dude, I really appreciate both of you setting up this debate and coming on. And fighting through the technical difficulties. I think this was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, sorry again about that.